Let's have a nice cup of TRE in the afternoon with Hannah Murray.
Good afternoon. Joining us on the line now is Emma Tarlo. She's an anthropologist and writer whose latest book, Under the Hornbeams, is a true story of life in the open. It's a unique, life-affirming memoir about her friendship with two men living in Regent's Park. Welcome to the show, Emma.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us. So can you tell us, go back to the beginning then and the circumstances as to how you met Nick and Pascal?
Yes, so it was in the early days of the sort of lockdowns of the pandemic, just at the beginning of April 2020, and I was walking in Regent's Park and got into conversation with these two men who were just living under the trees without a tent. And when I returned there the next day, I happened to have some soup on the boil at home, and I just sort of spontaneously really said to them, "Oh, would you like some soup?" And they said yes. And then I realized I didn't have a flask to put it in. And they handed me their flask, and I was very struck by that incredible act of trust that they had almost nothing. They're living outside. But they hand this flask to a complete stranger. So, of course, I went back and I filled this flask with soup. And this sort of began a kind of ritual almost where, in the end, I ended up sort of cooking for them most days during the pandemic and spending a lot of time with them. So it was really the beginning of the development of a friendship.
Yeah, amazing. And they lived in London and London streets outside for nearly 2 decades, yet didn't call themselves homeless.
Yes, there was something very remarkable about them. Sort of Nick would say, you know, we're not homeless, this is our home, pointing to the trees, and this sense that the world is our home. And one of the things that was really striking when I met them, because there was so much anxiety around during the pandemic, and you could see that anxiety on everybody's faces, except on theirs. They were living in a very day-to-day way, embracing the beauty of the day, and not at all anxious in the same way that other people were around. So in a sense, they were a rather extraordinary example of how to live, in spite of the fact that they were living in circumstances that most of us would feel utterly impossible.
Yeah. So did you find out about their background and as to how and why they ended up there?
Yes, so obviously I wasn't sort of firing questions at them. We sort of got to know each other gradually as time went on through sort of multiple, very lengthy conversations over the year. And in fact, I'm still friendly with them now. So gradually their stories, life stories, would come out. And I'm not going to give away what those are, but just to say that there isn't a decisive sort of answer. Why are these people in the street? What led them there? It's more different factors in life that may have contributed towards how living outside somehow made more sense to them than being inside, which they considered almost a trap.
Gosh, so they were quite happy where they lived then.
In many ways, they exhibited more sort of contentment in life than most people I know, which was one of the kind of remarkable things about them. And it's something that I think strikes many people who meet them. And one of the things I noticed as the year progressed is how many different people would pass by and sort of tell their stories to them, kind of almost unburdening themselves of issues that were going on in their life that they might not be able to share with members of the family or people at work, but that they felt they could express to people who were outside. So although they were in some ways standing outside of society, they were also in other ways quite integrated to it and contributing to it in ways that you really wouldn't expect.
Yeah. And how are they surviving? I mean, do they have money? How are they eating from day to day?
They didn't have any money or source of income at all, or shelter, or fire to cook food, or light. So basically, they were completely reliant on what people brought, if they did bring things. And actually, people did. So this was also something that I became aware of, these kind of unexpected networks of support, completely informal, but people sort of looking out for Nick and Pascal. So, for example, the guy who was a sweeper down by the canal, who himself, was definitely quite poor and living quite a tough life, but he would actually leave flasks of hot water for them every morning and had been doing it for years.
Wow.
So that sense of people sort of looking out for each other, people from all different walks of life coming together. And one of the other characters in the book is a man named Bachi, who is an ex-trader, so someone who's come from a wealthy background, although with a very complicated life history himself. And he would actually do a little online shop every week for them. I would come down with home-cooked food. Other people would pop in from time to time. And actually, so somehow they were never hungry. And sometimes, to my surprise, they'd be offering me food because someone had come down with too many oranges or too many packets of biscuits, and they couldn't store it, and they didn't know what to do with it. So they say, have it, And I also realized how important it is to also receive things and not just give things, because that's part of a relationship of giving and receiving. And that's very much something that we developed, So from, I even accepted, pillows from them that somebody had given them that they didn't want, that had been sitting kind of wrapped up in the park for a whole year, and in the end, they were trying to offloading these pillows on me. And I said, okay, and I use those pillows.
Oh, amazing. So how did they meet? Did they meet living on the street, or did they end up on the street together? What's their kind of background in terms of that?
Yes, no, that is also sort of covered in the book. So they're actually introduced to each other. Well, they're both living in the street, but in different parts of London. And they're introduced by someone who senses that he thinks that they'll get on. And so he sort of says to Nick, the older of the two, I've met someone who I think thinks like you. And Nick said to me, well, nobody thinks, as I do, or nobody thinks the same way as anybody else. But nonetheless, he went and he met Pascal, and they both, in a sense, incredibly different personalities. I cannot stress how different they are. One very, very sort of gregarious and talkative, and the other very, very silent. But they got on well, and they look out for each other, and they live alongside each other, and have been doing so for what is now over 20 years, in fact.
Incredible. So are they not looking to get off the streets? Is their goal not to end up in a house with a job? Are they wanting to stay where they are? Are they happy with their lives as it is?
I mean, in a sense, yes, they definitely avoided contexts where people were trying to, sort of hoover them into housing, so to speak, or to hostels and things like that, because they preferred to be outside in relation to what other options were available to them. And they got a lot of nourishment from being outside and from the sort of beauty of nature at the same time as experiencing the incredible hardship of it. And I cannot overemphasize how tough that is to be outside, come rain, come snow, come hail, come wind, without any possibility of sort of retreating from that. But somehow they lived that as a kind of challenge, almost in the way that some people live extreme sports, or some ascetics who sort of give up everything, might live in that way of kind of experiencing it as a challenge of what can you endure and what can you learn from that challenge. So they were very interesting people that one can learn a lot from, in fact.
And do they have any possessions? Do they have any kind of mementos that they've carried around with them for many years that really mean a lot to them?
Yes, that's an interesting question. I mean, most of the things they possess are things that people have given them, and sometimes, and sometimes, of course, people give them things that are appropriate to them. Other times, there are things that aren't, which they then try to sort of give to other people. And they had, I would say, Pascal had a French-English dictionary that he'd had for many years, and in fact now takes refuge in my house. And and Nick had a number of books that he valued very highly, and again, those I kind of keep safe now under the spare room in my house, under the bed. Nick also had sort of identity papers, so he had kept some things like that. But on the whole, they hadn't kept much from their pasts, I would say.
Wow. So do you think in general we have a real kind of misconception of homeless people? I know you said they don't like to see themselves as homeless, but people who are living outside. Or do you think these two men are particularly unique and special in the way they view their situation?
I think they are quite unique in many ways, but I think also they are a kind of lesson to us not to generalize too readily and not to assume that we know or understand what someone's life is about, when we haven't got to know them, because in fact there are all sorts of different stories that might bring people to the street, and there are all sorts of ways of living in the street, and one might be living in a state of misery or destitution or drug addiction or so forth. Those things do exist, but there are also people like Nick and Pascal who are perhaps living that as a kind of alternative way of understanding what life is about, or putting into practice different values. So I think it's kind of, it's a good way of recognizing that we don't necessarily understand what we see, and that actually when you engage with people and get to know them, then you may understand their particular circumstances and their particular attitudes to life.
Yeah, it is a real lesson, the idea of not judging people when you have no idea who they are or their background and what their story is.
Exactly. I think that was very much something that I learned, and very much I could see that other people interacting with Nick and Pascal also learned. And I think it's also a kind of reminder to us that there are all sorts of interesting relationships we could be having with people around us who we might, just not have, simply because we don't take that step of kind of making that a possibility, in a sense, opening up conversations, and you never know quite where those might lead. Certainly when I first offered them some soup, I wasn't expecting to get involved with them in the way that I did. And I think, part of what the book is about is that it's really about our relationship, not just about their life, but also, what I bring to them, but what they bring to me as well, as a kind of lessons in how to live in the moment, how to different understandings of what freedom might look like, if you like. It's the year that I decided to give up my job, for example, and in a sense opt for a more free way of living, and the possible insecurity that comes with that.
Wow. So meeting them has had a massive effect on you and changes in your life then.
Yes, I think it was, yes, I would say that it did. And the other thing that it brought to my life, I would say in a very positive way, is the appreciation of the natural environment. Because, before I met them, if the weather was what we might call bad, I would think, I'll wait until it stops raining before I go out. Or if it's a terrible storm, the last thing I'm going to do is go out into it. Once I became friendly with them, because I was so aware of their circumstances and how it might be nice to eat something hot if there's a terrible storm, or it's a dreadful rain and it hasn't stopped raining for 36 hours. So I would go out in all these different weathers, and I would say that through going out in all these different weathers, I experienced my own environment in a completely different way and got to really love those different aspects of the weather and of the seasons in a way that I would never have experienced before.
Wow. So the whole thing's been life-changing for you.
Yes, it's been a very positive experience. Yes, so I would say it has in many ways.
Yeah. And how do they feel about your book?
So they sort of, in a sense, encouraged me to write that book. Nick thought of it as a kind of archive of the times, and he said, it's ultimately about relationships, and what matters is relationships. And at the back of the book, they have actually added their thank yous to over 100 people who brought them things at different moments of their lives. And it's very interesting how those thank yous are expressed in their own words, and how varied those thank yous are, because it might be a thank you for a pizza, or it might be a thank you, for clothing, but it might also be for certain types of conversation, or for books that were shared, or for ideas. So you get a sense of the kind of range of things that interest them and what they've appreciated in their interactions with people over the years.
Yeah. Oh, it's a wonderful story. And I have to ask you about, I'm sure it's in the book, but just one question about their families. Do they not have any kind of family members or friends from the past that come to visit them or want to look out for them?
Certainly at the time that I knew them, they were not in contact with their families. Pascal, in fact, is French, and his family are in France. Nick is English, but he had not told his family where he was. So certainly at that time, they were not having any contact with their families. I suppose the one other sort of contact I think that's important to mention, that I sort of, if I wanted to sort of give a sense of the book, is animals. a lot of people are walking their dogs in the area where Nick and Pascal were living. And dogs became a very important sort of connecting social fiber, that somehow dogs gave people an excuse to be able to talk with them and interact with them. They would fill the sort of roots of the trees. There's a sort of bowl-like shape made by the roots, and they would fill that with water, so people's dogs would come to that. And Bachi, who visited them every evening, would come with his blind dog and found this as a sort of a very sort of nurturing space where the dog could relax and he could relax. So that sort of relationship with humans, animals, trees, the local, the environment, the park, are sort of very important aspects of the book.
Yeah. Wow. Well, it's a lovely story. Thank you so much for sharing it with us. If listeners want to get a copy of the book, it's called Under the Hornbeams, A True Story of Life in the Open. It's available on our website, TRE.radio, and it's by Emma Tarlo, who we've been chatting with today. Emma, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for inviting me.